GhastlyGarlic Episode 37. 5 True Ghost Stories. Home Not So Sweet Part 2. Story 1. The Blue House of Kedah. It was 2004, in a quiet neighborhood in Kedah, Malaysia. The air was thick with the humid warmth of the tropics, and the nights were often eerily silent, broken only by the distant croaking of frogs and the occasional rustle of leaves. My family and I found ourselves in need of temporary accommodation while our home was being renovated. We were only supposed to be there for 6 months, and so the search for a rental house began. My close friend, Sue, accompanied me as we drove around the neighborhood. It was late afternoon when we passed by a house that caught my eye. A large, old blue house that seemed to stand out among the rest. The paint was faded, almost as if the house itself had given up on resisting the passage of time. Moss grew in patches on the walls, giving it a peculiar charm that I couldn't quite describe. A sign hung loosely from the gate, swaying in the breeze, "For rent." "Look at that house," Sue said, pointing. "It's empty, and it's available for rent. It looks nice, doesn't it?" I nodded, feeling an inexplicable pull towards it. There was something about the house. Perhaps it was the large, covered balcony, or the way the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. Whatever it was, I found myself excited to tell my parents about it. My mother and father agreed to rent the house. A week later, we moved in. The moment we stepped inside, I noticed a strange feeling in the air, like a heavy, lingering presence that clung to the walls. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. My father, who was typically very observant, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. He was more concerned with finding a comfortable spot to lie down and watch television, his favorite pastime. The first few days were uneventful, but there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't shake. Perhaps it was the fact that the house felt too large for just the 5 of us. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways after sunset. Then, in the second week, something happened that would change everything. It was late one night, past midnight, and I was sitting at my study desk, preparing for my upcoming exams. My room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the small lamp on my desk. The room felt cold, despite the warm, tropical air outside. I glanced at the mirror on my desk, which allowed me to see the door behind me. As I scribbled notes, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced at the mirror and froze. Standing right behind me, with a serious expression on his face, was my father. His eyes were wide open, staring intently at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, but there was no one there. I blinked, confused and shaken. Had I imagined it? I stood up, unlocked my door, and stepped into the hallway. The living room was just a few steps away, and I could see my father sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, which was turned off. "Abba," I called out softly. He didn't respond. His body was stiff, his eyes still wide open, unblinking. The sight was unnerving, to say the least. I approached him cautiously, unsure of what I was seeing. The air around him felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I reached out to shake him, but he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the empty screen. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but I also needed to use the bathroom. As I made my way to the bathroom, I bumped into my mother in the hallway. "Mama, can you check on Abba? He's acting really strange," I said, my voice trembling. She looked at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? Your father's been in bed for hours. He's not feeling well tonight." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But he's in the living room," I whispered. My mother stared at me for a moment, then quickly made her way to the living room. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. But when we reached the living room, it was empty. The television was off, and the couch was cold. My mother turned to me, her expression stern. "Stop playing games. Go to bed." I nodded numbly and hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I slept with the lights on, my heart racing until exhaustion finally overtook me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the events of the previous night. I convinced myself that I had been tired, that my mind had played tricks on me. It was a rational explanation, and I clung to it. But the house had other plans. It was early morning, and I was helping my mother in the kitchen. We were peeling onions for the food stall we ran. My younger brother, Mode, was supposed to be at school, but as I peeled the onions, I saw him dash through the kitchen, leaping over the basket of onions without a word. Mode, be careful, don't you see what I'm doing here? I shouted after him, annoyed at his carelessness. My mother looked up from her work, puzzled. What are you talking about? Mode's at school. He left early this morning for sports practice. My hands froze mid-peel, and I felt that same cold dread from the night before. But I just saw him. He ran right through here. My mother shook her head, her eyes narrowing with concern. You're tired, you've been studying too much. Go rest for a while. I nodded slowly, but I knew what I had seen. There was no mistaking it. I had felt the rush of air as Mode had run past me, had seen the blur of his figure as he moved through the room, but he wasn't here. He couldn't have been. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress of exams and the unfamiliar house were getting to me. But deep down, I knew that something was very, very wrong. 1 week later, we were called away to our hometown in Pahang due to a family emergency. We left the Blue House in a hurry, packing only the essentials and locking the doors behind us. It was a relief to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the house, even if only for a short while. When we returned, the air felt different, as if the house itself had been holding its breath while we were gone. As we pulled into the driveway, our neighbor, Maxikani, waved us over, her face pale and drawn. You've been gone? She asked, her voice shaky. My mother nodded. Yes, we were away for a week. Why? Maxikani's eyes widened in horror, and she dropped the container of food she was holding. I thought you were still here. I saw lights on in the house every night. I heard noises, people talking, doors opening and closing, even the sound of someone cooking. And your son, Mode, he was sitting outside every night. I tried talking to him, but he never responded. I even saw your husband walking around the house, but when I called out to him, he just ignored me. My mother's face turned white. That's impossible. We've been gone this whole time. Maxikani looked terrified. Tai, I thought it was strange, but I didn't think it could be something else. We all felt it then, a cold shiver that ran through us, as if the house itself was listening, waiting for us to enter once again. My mother quickly ushered us inside, her face set in a grim expression. She didn't want to show it, but I could see the fear in her eyes. That night, as we settled back into the house, the atmosphere felt more oppressive than ever. My father, usually calm and composed, seemed agitated. He paced the living room, muttering to himself, while my mother busied herself with cleaning the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in the house. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows, seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I kept the lights on, too afraid to be engulfed in darkness. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and unease. My father continued to act strangely, often disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. My mother grew increasingly worried, though she tried to hide it from us. It was on the last night, before we were to leave the Blue House for good, that everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a soft knocking at my door. I sat up, my heart racing, and called out softly, "Who is it?" There was no answer, only the sound of the door creaking open. I clutched the blanket tightly, my breath catching in my throat as I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was my father. He stood there, his face pale and expressionless, his eyes wide and unblinking. But there was something wrong, something terribly wrong. His features were distorted, as if his face was made of wax and someone had started to melt it. His eyes were too large, his mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes. I screamed, backing away until I was pressed against the headboard of my bed. The figure in the doorway didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with that horrifying smile. "Abba!" I screamed, but I knew it wasn't him. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't my father. The lights in my room flickered, casting strange, dancing shadows across the walls. I scrambled off the bed, pushing past the figure and running down the hallway to my parents' room. I burst through the door, sobbing, and found my mother sitting on the bed, holding my father's hand. He was asleep, his breathing shallow and labored. My mother looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. What's wrong? I couldn't speak. Could only point back down the hallway where I had come from. My mother frowned and stood up, walking past me to see what I was pointing at. I followed her hesitantly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back, to run away. When we reached my room, the door was wide open, the light still flickering. But the figure was gone. My mother turned to me, her face pale. "You're coming with us. We are leaving this house tonight." We packed what we could in a hurry, leaving the rest behind. As we drove away from the Blue House, I looked back one last time, and saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching us go. We never returned to the Blue House. My father's health worsened after we left, and he passed away a few months later. My mother refused to speak about what had happened, and we moved into our renovated home in silence. It wasn't until years later that I found out the truth. Maxik Ani had finally confided in my mother, telling her the full story of the Blue House. The house had been empty for 8 years before we moved in, abandoned by its previous occupants, who had fled after only a few weeks. Every family that had lived there had experienced strange, terrifying occurrences, distorted figures in the night, voices calling out in the dark, and the feeling of being watched. But it wasn't just the house. Whatever lived there had followed us, attaching itself to my father. It had taken his image, using it to torment us, to try and break us. And in the end, it had succeeded. We never spoke of the Blue House again. It remained a dark memory, a shadow that lingered at the edges of our minds. But I knew, deep down, that it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Story 2, The Housemate. It was a typical Friday evening in the bustling city, and the streets were alive with the sounds of honking cars and chattering pedestrians. I had just returned from a quick dinner at the local eatery. The air was heavy with the scent of fried food and the distant echoes of the evening prayers, signaling the onset of night. As I arrived at the rental house, I noticed how quiet the place had become. The house, which I shared with 5 other students, was eerily silent. Usually, the weekends meant that everyone would return home to their families, leaving me alone in the large, old house. Tonight was no different, at least, that's what I thought. The house itself was a relic from the past, with creaky wooden floors and tall, narrow windows that rattled with the slightest breeze. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that seemed to curl at the edges, as if trying to escape the weight of the years. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped into the dimly lit living room. The only light came from the small lamp on the side table, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw my housemate, Man, lying on the couch, half asleep in front of the TV. "Man, you didn't go back home?" I asked, surprised to see him there. He responded with a nonchalant grunt, barely moving from his spot. Later, he mumbled, eyes still fixed on the TV screen. I shrugged, not thinking much of it. "All right then, let's grab some food later. My bike's busted, so I'll need a ride." "Yeah, sure," he muttered, his voice trailing off as he seemed to drift back into his half-slumber. I made my way upstairs to my room, deciding to freshen up before we headed out. The old wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and I could hear the faint echo of my footsteps bouncing off the empty walls. Once in my room, I cleaned up quickly, then sat by the window to chat with my girlfriend over the phone. The cool evening breeze filtered through the slightly open window, offering a brief respite from the lingering heat of the day. As I spoke on the phone, I heard the distinctive clatter of the front door's grille being opened. I assumed it was Man, finally getting up to leave. "Man, where are you going?" I called out from the window, my voice echoing down the stairs. "Markin," he replied, his voice low and flat. "Wait up, I'm coming with you," I shouted, rushing to hang up the phone. I threw on a jacket and dashed downstairs, eager to catch up with him. But when I reached the living room, the house was completely still. The front door was wide open, but there was no sign of Man. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the now empty TV screen. I stepped outside, scanning the dark, deserted street. There was no one in sight. The usual buzz of the neighborhood seemed to have faded away, leaving only an unsettling stillness. I cursed under my breath, annoyed that Man had left without me. I decided to walk to the nearby eatery, hoping to catch up with him there. The walk was uneventful, though the quietness of the neighborhood felt more oppressive than usual. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out towards me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At the eatery, I didn't see Man. I tried calling him, but my phone showed no signal. Frustrated, I grabbed a quick bite and decided to head back home, still fuming over being left behind. When I returned to the house, I found the sliding glass door locked. That was odd. None of us ever locked that door since the landlord had mentioned that the key was lost long ago. I couldn't understand how it could have been locked from the inside. "Man, open up. What's wrong with you?" I shouted, banging on the glass. There was no response. The house remained dark and silent. I pulled out my phone again, trying to call Man. This time, the call went through. "Man, where the hell are you? Open the door." I yelled into the phone. "What's your problem?" Man's voice came through, sounding irritated. "I went home this morning after class. I'm at my parents' place. Why are you calling me?" His words hit me like a ton of bricks. My heart skipped a beat, and my blood ran cold. "But I saw you earlier. You were lying on the couch watching TV. I talked to you." I stammered, confusion and fear creeping into my voice. "That wasn't me," Man replied, his voice now tinged with unease. "I left early in the morning. You must be mistaken." I stood there, staring at the dark, empty house. If Man had been gone all day, then who, or what, had I spoken to? Panic started to set in as I replayed the events in my mind. I distinctly remembered seeing someone on the couch, hearing Man's voice answering me. But now, the pieces didn't fit together. I slowly backed away from the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was terribly wrong. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, I hurried over to a friend's house just a few doors down. I knocked on the door, trying to keep my nerves in check. When he answered, I quickly explained what had happened, my voice trembling with fear. Listened, his expression growing more serious with each word. "You should stay here tonight. That house, it's old. Weird things happen in places like that." I agreed, too shaken to go back. That night, I lay awake in my friend's guest room, staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing, replaying every detail of the evening. The more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that something sinister was at play. Morning came, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I decided to confront the situation head-on. After all, I couldn't avoid the house forever. With my friend accompanying me, I returned to the rental house. We walked up the driveway, and I noticed something strange. The sliding door, which had been locked the night before, was now slightly ajar. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, and a cold chill ran down my spine. We cautiously entered the house, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence. The living room was exactly as I had left it, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. My friend and I checked every room, but there was nothing out of place. Everything was just as we had left it, except for one thing. The windows, which had all been shut tightly before, were now open. Every single one of them. "What the hell?" my friend muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We checked the windows, but there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if they had opened on their own. As we stood in the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening, we heard a noise from upstairs, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. We exchanged a nervous glance and slowly made our way up the stairs. The tapping grew louder as we approached the second floor. My heart was in my throat, and my hands shook as I reached for the door handle to my room. The door creaked open, revealing my room just as I had left it. The tapping sound stopped abruptly. My friend stepped in behind me, and we both froze. There, on my desk, was a small, wooden box that I had never seen before. It was old, with intricate carvings on the lid, and looked out of place in the otherwise mundane room. "Where did that come from?" my friend asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have no idea," I replied, inching closer to the box. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to open it. The lid creaked as it lifted, revealing a collection of old, yellowed photographs. I picked one up, my hands trembling. The photograph was of a group of people, smiling at the camera. But their faces were blurred, almost as if they were moving too fast for the camera to capture. I shuffled through the rest of the photographs, each one more disturbing than the last. There were images of the house, taken from angles that seemed impossible, like someone had been standing inside the walls, watching us. I dropped the photographs, my stomach turning with nausea. This isn't right. We need to get out of here. My friend didn't argue. We backed out of the room, leaving the box and its contents behind. As we reached the top of the stairs, the tapping started again, louder this time, coming from inside the walls. We ran out of the house, not stopping until we were back at my friend's place. I was shaking, my mind reeling from what we had just experienced. Later that night, I tried to piece together what was happening. The photographs, the tapping, the figure I had seen, none of it made any sense. The house was old, yes, but this went beyond any ordinary haunting. I decided to do some research, hoping to find answers. I dug through old records, online forums, and local legends, trying to find anything that could explain the strange occurrences. That's when I came across the story of a family that had lived in the house decades ago. The details were vague, but it was said that they had all died under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed that the father had gone mad, driven to insanity by voices in the walls. Others spoke of an ancient curse, tied to the land on which the house was built. But the most chilling part was the legend of the Penunggu, an unseen spirit that was said to guard certain places, tormenting anyone who dared to disturb its domain. It was said that the Penunggu could take on the appearance of those it had claimed, trapping their souls in an endless cycle of torment. The pieces began to fall into place. The figure I had seen, the photographs, the tapping, it was all connected. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and I had somehow become its target. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed up my belongings, leaving behind anything that could be tied to the curse. But as I was leaving, I realized that I had to know for sure. I had to face whatever was in that house one last time. I returned to the house, this time alone. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to move on its own. I made my way to my room, where the wooden box still sat on the desk. The photographs were scattered across the floor, as if someone had rifled through them in a hurry. But what caught my attention was the mirror on the wall. It was cracked, a jagged line running down the center, distorting my reflection. I stared at the mirror, my heart pounding. That's when I saw it. A figure standing behind me, its face a twisted reflection of my own. It was smiling, a cold, menacing grin that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figure in the mirror was gone. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the tapping again, louder and more insistent than ever. It was coming from behind the walls, from the very heart of the house. I knew then that I had to leave, but the house had other plans. The front door slammed shut, the locks clicking into place. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered wildly. I was trapped. The tapping grew louder, turning into a frantic pounding that seemed to come from all directions. The walls shook, and I could feel the floorboards shifting beneath my feet. Desperate, I ran to the back door, but it too was locked. I was surrounded, the house closing in on me, as if it were alive, determined to keep me there. And then, everything went still. The pounding stopped, the lights steadied, and the house fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was man, or at least something that looked like him, staring down at me with cold, lifeless eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me, as the air grew colder and colder. I could feel the life being sucked out of the room, as if the very essence of the house was feeding off my fear. I knew I had to do something, anything, to escape. I reached for the nearest object, a heavy bookend, and hurled it at the figure. It passed right through him, shattering the mirror behind him. The figure flickered, then disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark, empty house. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Somehow, I managed to break a window and escape the house. I ran through the night, not stopping until I was far away from that cursed place. I never went back. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The house was eventually sold, but I never found out what happened to it, or to the new tenants. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The house, the figure, the tapping, they still haunt my dreams, a constant reminder of the terror I faced. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it again. That faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. It's a sound that will stay with me forever. A reminder that some places are better left alone, and some spirits are never truly at rest. Years have passed since that fateful night, but the memories remain as vivid as ever. I've tried to move on, to put the past behind me, but it's never that simple. Every so often, I hear stories, whispers of strange occurrences in that old neighborhood. People speak of shadows moving on their own, of voices echoing through empty rooms, of a cold, malevolent presence that watches from the darkness. Some say the house has been abandoned, left to rot as nature slowly reclaims it. Others claim that it's still occupied, that new tenants have moved in, unaware of the horrors that lie within. But I know the truth. The Penungu is still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. It's only a matter of time before it finds a new victim, someone else to trap in its endless cycle of torment. And when that happens, I'll be ready. I'll be waiting, listening for that familiar tapping, knowing that the nightmare is far from over. For some things can never be forgotten, and some places can never be escaped. Story 3, The Echoes of Shadowed Steps. The night had settled heavily over Kuala Lumpur, casting the city in a thick veil of darkness. In a modest apartment, nestled within the city's bustling heart, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The apartment was small but comfortable, a temporary home for a young woman named No. Her husband had recently taken up a new job across the straits, leaving her alone with their 2 small children. Her mother, who had come from Kuching to help with the impending move back to Miri, was staying with them for a few weeks. No's evenings were routine, washing clothes, tidying up, and keeping an eye on the children as they drifted off to sleep. Tonight, as the clock ticked closer to 9, she found herself in the middle of her usual tasks, shuffling between the living room and the washing machine. The TV was on, playing some forgettable show, its flickering light casting long shadows across the room. Her mother, ever the night owl, was in the guest room, busy sewing under a dim light. As No stood in the living room, her attention split between the TV and her chores, she suddenly felt the presence of someone beside her. She could sense her mother's familiar presence, the soft rustling of her clothes, the faint scent of jasmine that always clung to her. Without looking directly, No saw her mother's figure in her peripheral vision, standing quietly beside her. A thought flickered in her mind, a playful urge to joke with her mother about the lack of interesting shows on TV. But something held her back. She remained still, her eyes fixed on the screen, her heart beginning to thud in her chest. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, thick with an invisible tension. Then, without a word, the figure moved past her and walked into No's bedroom. For a moment, No stood frozen, the remote slipping from her grasp and clattering onto the floor. A strange chill ran down her spine, a cold that seeped into her bones. Her mother's sewing machine hummed softly from the other room, a distant sound that now felt worlds away. No shook off the unease and rationalized the situation. Maybe her mother was checking on the children, she thought, though it was odd that she would use the bathroom in No's room when there was another one closer to her own. Still, she convinced herself it was nothing out of the ordinary. She hesitated at the threshold of her bedroom, the door slightly ajar. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind her. She reached in and flicked on the light, the fluorescent bulb flickering to life with a faint hum. The bed was neatly made, the children's toys scattered in their usual disarray, but there was no sign of her mother. No's breath caught in her throat as she crossed the room to the bathroom. She pushed the door open, half expecting to see her mother inside, but the bathroom was empty, the air still and cold. The mirror above the sink reflected her pale, wide-eyed face, a look of confusion and fear etched into her features. She turned off the light and walked back to her mother's room, her steps quickening as the sense of dread grew. She found her mother exactly where she'd been earlier, hunched over her sewing machine, the rhythmic sound of the needle a stark contrast to the silence in the rest of the apartment. "Mac, did you just come into my room?" No asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her mother looked up, puzzled. "No, I've been here the whole time." "Why?" No swallowed hard, her mind racing. I thought I saw you in my room. I saw you standing next to me in the living room, and then you walked into my room." Her mother's expression shifted, the playful light in her eyes dimming. "I haven't left this room since Isha prayers," she said softly, her tone serious now. A cold realization washed over Nur. She had seen something that looked like her mother, but wasn't. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. She didn't say anything more to her mother, not wanting to alarm her, but the fear gnawed at her insides. That night, Nur lay awake in bed, every creak and groan of the apartment amplified in the silence. The image of the shadowy figure, her mother's doppelganger, replayed in her mind over and over. She tried to convince herself that it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the apartment grew increasingly oppressive. Strange things began to happen. An eerie whispering that seemed to come from the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and the persistent feeling of being watched. One morning, as Nur prepared for the day, she heard a faint shushing sound close to her ear, as if someone were trying to silence her. She spun around, expecting to see her son, but found nothing. He was still asleep in his bed, undisturbed. Nur's nerves were fraying, her usually strong demeanor giving way to fear. She wanted to tell her husband, but he was far away, and she didn't want to worry him. She considered telling her mother, but decided against it. She didn't want to burden her with these strange occurrences. So, she kept it to herself, hoping it would all just go away. But the nights were the worst. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt that presence again, standing beside her bed, watching her. She could almost hear the soft rustle of clothes, smell the faint scent of jasmine. It was always there, just out of sight. A shadowy figure that seemed to be waiting for something. One particularly dark night, as a storm raged outside, Nur's fear reached its peak. The power had gone out, plunging the apartment into total darkness. The wind howled through the trees outside, and the rain lashed against the windows. In the pitch black, Nur lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mother was asleep in the other room, and the children were tucked in beside her. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, cold, clammy, and unmistakably real. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hand didn't move, didn't squeeze, just rested there, heavy and ominous. Nur squeezed her eyes shut, praying for it to go away, but the presence didn't leave. It lingered, pressing down on her, suffocating her with its coldness. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand was gone. Nur gasped, sitting up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was empty, the darkness thick and impenetrable. She reached for the bedside lamp, but the power was still out. In the dim light of her phone, she scanned the room, but there was nothing there, nothing but the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in her chest. The next morning, Nur could barely bring herself to talk. She went through the motions of her day, her mind elsewhere, haunted by the events of the night before. She knew she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. Whatever was haunting her wasn't going to leave on its own. When her mother suggested they leave for Miri earlier than planned, Nur didn't hesitate. They packed up their belongings and left the apartment that very day, leaving behind the shadowy presence that had tormented her. But as they drove away, Nur couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had followed her wouldn't be so easily left behind. As they settled into their new home in Miri, Nur tried to forget about the strange happenings in Kuala Lumpur. But the memories lingered, creeping into her thoughts when she least expected it. She avoided mirrors at night, and every so often, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing just out of sight. Years later, when Nur recounted the story to her children, now grown, she realized that the fear never truly left her. It was there, deep down, a part of her that would always be haunted by the echoes of shadowed steps. Story 4, The Uninvited Guest. In the heart of Kuala Lumpur, amidst the bustling city life, Zaza's rented terrace house stood eerily quiet. The house had seen better days, now worn and shadowed by the passage of time. It was a weekend, and Zaza, a university student, had the place to herself as her housemates had returned to their hometowns. Normally, this solitude was welcomed, but tonight felt different, unsettling. The day had been typical. Zaza and her friend, Nina, had spent the afternoon at the popular shopping spots, soaking in the lively atmosphere of Bukit Bintang. They returned home late, arms full of shopping bags, their spirits high. The house, however, seemed to have a different energy, a heaviness in the air that neither could quite place. Zaza shrugged it off, attributing it to the quietness of the empty house. They went upstairs to Zaza's room, eager to try on their new clothes. As they laughed and chatted, a faint noise from downstairs interrupted their moment of joy, a soft thud, like something heavy had hit the floor. Nina glanced at Zaza, her eyebrows furrowed. "Did you hear that?" Zaza hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe one of the housemates came back early." Nina frowned. "On a Saturday night? I doubt it." Still, the thought of another person in the house was somewhat comforting. They continued their conversation, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in the pit of their stomachs. But then, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from the staircase, creeping closer and closer to their room. Zaza's heart began to race. "Nina, did you lock the front door?" Nina nodded. "Of course, I did. But what if?" Her voice trailed off, her mind racing with possibilities. "Maybe someone has a spare key." The footsteps stopped right outside Zaza's door, followed by the unmistakable jingle of keys, like someone fumbling to find the right one. Zaza's breath caught in her throat. The door was already locked from the inside, but the thought of someone, or something, standing on the other side sent a shiver down her spine. "Who's there?" Zaza called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. Instead, the door handle rattled violently, as though someone was trying to force their way in. Nina grabbed Zaza's arm, her face pale. "Zaza, I don't think that's a person." Zaza's mind raced, trying to remember any stories she'd heard about the house. It had always felt a little strange, but nothing like this had ever happened before. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang, like something heavy had been thrown against the door. The force of it made the whole room tremble. Without thinking, Zaza and Nina ran to the window, but it was tightly shut, the latches rusted and immovable. They were trapped. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was outside was becoming increasingly desperate to get in. Suddenly, everything went silent. The absence of noise was almost as terrifying as the banging had been. Zaza and Nina stood frozen, listening intently, but all they could hear was their own rapid breathing. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Just when they thought the worst was over, a soft, chilling voice whispered from the other side of the door, "Zaza, open the door." Nina's grip tightened on Zaza's arm. "That's not one of your housemates," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Zaza nodded, her mind a whirl of fear and confusion. The voice had sounded familiar, eerily so, but there was something off about it. Something unnatural. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the entire house was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving them in pitch blackness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. Nina reached for her phone, but her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She managed to switch on the flashlight, the small beam cutting through the darkness. They both jumped as the door creaked open, revealing an empty hallway bathed in shadow. Nina directed the light down the hallway, revealing nothing but emptiness. "Zaza, we need to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Zaza nodded, her mind screaming for her to move, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. They crept toward the door, the beam of light shaking as they walked. The house seemed to groan around them, the old wood settling in ways it never had before. As they reached the staircase, they froze. At the bottom stood a figure, shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an eerie light that sent a jolt of terror through Zaza's entire being. Who are you?" Zaza managed to stammer, though she already knew there would be no human answer. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around them grew colder, so cold that their breath formed visible puffs in the dark. Then, with a speed that defied all logic, the figure lunged toward them, a blow of darkness and cold. Zaza and Nina screamed, stumbling backward into the room, slamming the door shut behind them. They pressed their backs against it, as though their combined weight could keep out whatever horror was trying to break through. The banging resumed, harder and faster this time, as if the entity was furious that they had escaped. The walls shook with each impact, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. "Zaza, what do we do?" Nina's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with terror. Zaza didn't have an answer. Her mind raced, trying to think of something, anything that could help them. Then, in the midst of the chaos, She remembered something her grandmother had once told her about spirits, how they were often drawn to something, someone, and how they could be banished if you severed the connection. But what was the connection here? Why was this spirit haunting them? Suddenly, it hit her. The shopping bags. Earlier, at one of the street markets, Zaza had bought an old, ornate mirror. Something about it had caught her eye, something she couldn't quite explain. It was just a cheap trinket, a curiosity, but now she wondered if it was more than that. Nina, the mirror. Zaza shouted over the noise. It's in the bag, get rid of it. Nina looked at her, confused and terrified, but she didn't argue. She scrambled to the pile of shopping bags and pulled out the mirror. It was heavier than it looked, its surface tarnished and dull. Without hesitating, Nina flung the mirror across the room, smashing it against the wall. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and for a moment, everything went still. The banging stopped, the air warmed slightly, and the house seemed to exhale, as if releasing a long-held breath. But the relief was short-lived. From the shards of the broken mirror, a dark mist began to rise, coalescing into the shape of the figure that had been at the bottom of the stairs. It loomed larger now, its form more defined, more menacing. "You shouldn't have done that," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Zaza and Nina backed away, their fear reaching a new peak. The figure advanced on them, the room growing colder with each step it took. Zaza's mind was screaming, her body frozen with terror. There was no escape, nowhere to run. As the figure reached out a hand, the temperature plummeted even further. Zaza could see her breath in the air, her body trembling uncontrollably. Then, just as it was about to touch her, the front door downstairs burst open with a loud crash. "Zaza!" A voice called out, a familiar voice, warm and alive. It was Zaza's boyfriend, who had been worried when she didn't answer his calls. He had decided to come over and check on her. His sudden arrival seemed to break the spell that had gripped the house. The figure recoiled, hissing in anger and frustration. It seemed to dissolve into the air, fading into the shadows until there was nothing left but the sound of Zaza's and Nina's ragged breathing. They didn't wait to see if it would return. They grabbed their things and fled down the stairs, out the front door, into the cold night air. Zaza's boyfriend stood there, confused and concerned, but Zaza couldn't explain what had happened. She didn't have the words. All she knew was that they were safe, for now. But as they drove away from the house, Zaza couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever had been in that house was still watching, still waiting. And she was right. As they disappeared into the night, the figure reappeared in the window of Zaza's room, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. This was just the beginning. Story 5, The Haunting of Seremban 2. It was a bright Sunday morning, and the air around the neighborhood was thick with anticipation. The new house in Seremban 2 was supposed to be a fresh start for Eddie and his friends, a place where they could build memories and escape the stress of city life. But the house, with its seemingly ordinary exterior, harbored secrets far darker than any of them could have imagined. They had barely settled in when strange things began to happen. Eddie, along with his childhood friends, Kamal and Fikri, had been staying there for a week. The house was spacious, with a large yard perfect for weekend barbecues, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. It seemed like a dream come true, until it wasn't. That morning, they decided to have breakfast outside, enjoying the cool breeze. The nasi lemak they had bought from a nearby stall was delicious, but there was an unease in the air that none of them could shake. Despite the bright sun, the house behind them loomed with an ominous presence, its windows dark and foreboding. They couldn't explain it, but none of them wanted to go back inside just yet. Eddie kept glancing at the house, feeling an inexplicable dread gnawing at his gut. "Do you guys feel it too?" he asked, his voice low. Kamal nodded, his usually cheerful demeanor subdued. "Yeah, it's like something's wrong." Fikri, always the skeptic, scoffed. "You're both overreacting. It's just a house. We're probably just jittery because it's new." But as the morning wore on, their unease grew. They were expecting Kamal's family to visit later that day, bringing with them a renowned healer from Banting. It seemed excessive, but after the events of the previous night, they were willing to try anything to rid the house of its unsettling atmosphere. The night before had been one of sheer terror. They had heard whispers in the dark, sounds that didn't belong in a house so new. Doors creaked open on their own, shadows moved without a source, and the cold spot in the hallway grew colder by the hour. But the worst was yet to come. By the time Kamal's family arrived, the tension was palpable. His parents, along with his siblings, had come in 3 cars, bringing with them Tok Sheikh, a respected figure known for his ability to cleanse homes of malevolent spirits. The moment Tok Sheikh stepped out of the car, he looked up at the house and shook his head, his expression grim. "This house," he murmured, his voice heavy with concern. "It's not right." He greeted them all with a firm handshake, and when he grasped Eddie's hand, he frowned. "Your spirits have been weakened," he said cryptically. "They've been summoned." Eddie didn't understand what he meant, but the words chilled him to the bone. Tok Sheikh insisted that Eddie, Kamal, and Fikri stay in the van while he and Kamal's father entered the house. The healer had barely stepped onto the porch when the old radio in the living room suddenly blared to life, the volume so loud it made everyone jump. The plug had been pulled out the night before, yet there it was, playing a haunting melody. It was an old Indian song, one that none of them recognized. Kamal's siblings, who had been eagerly waiting to explore the house, screamed in fright and bolted back to the cars. The rest of the family exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to approach the house. Minutes felt like hours as they waited in the van. Eddie could see the worry etched on everyone's faces, especially the children, who were huddled together in the back, their wide eyes filled with fear. Eddie wanted to comfort them, but he didn't know what to say. How do you reassure someone when you're not even sure you're safe yourself? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tok Sheikh emerged from the house, holding something that made Eddie's blood run cold. It was a large, brown teddy bear, one that they had thrown away just the day before. They had wrapped it in a black garbage bag and left it in the trash can outside, yet here it was, as if it had never been touched. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest as he nudged Kamal. "Look," he whispered, pointing at the bear. Kamal stared, his face pale. "That's impossible," he muttered. "We threw it away." Curiosity and fear gripped them as they ran to the trash can. Kamal tore open the bag they had left behind, only to find it filled with bricks and dirty laundry, items they had never placed there. The air around them seemed to thicken with a sense of foreboding as they exchanged horrified looks. Tok Sheikh approached them, his expression stern. "You should never have kept this in the house," he scolded, his voice laced with anger. "This bear is cursed." It was the anchor that allowed the spirits to manifest. The day wore on, and Tok Sheikh performed a cleansing ritual, sprinkling salt and holy water around the house, muttering prayers under his breath. Kamal's family brought in food from a nearby restaurant, and they held a small feast, hoping to lift the oppressive atmosphere. For a moment, the house felt lighter, the tension easing as the sun began to set. But that night, as the rain poured down and the wind howled outside, the true horror of the house revealed itself. It was Thursday night, and the storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. Kamal's parents, who had stayed behind to ensure everything was truly safe, sat with the boys in the living room, the flickering light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Despite the calm, Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had hoped that Tok Sheikh's cleansing would rid the house of whatever evil lingered, but the uneasy silence felt like the calm before the storm. As the clock struck midnight, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Kamal's mother suggested they pray together, and they gathered in a small circle, their voices blending as they recited verses from the Quran. But just as they began, a loud banging erupted from the back door, the sound reverberating through the house. Everyone froze, the words dying in their throats. The banging continued, growing more insistent, and then they heard it, the sound of water gushing from the bathroom, as if a tap had been left running at full blast. Eddie was the first to move, his heart racing as he ran to the kitchen. The sight that greeted him was impossible. The sink tap was on, water pouring out uncontrollably, even though he hadn't touched it. He reached out to turn it off, but the tap wouldn't budge. "Help me," he called out, and Kamal and Fikri rushed to his side. Together, they managed to turn off the tap, but as soon as they did, the water started flowing from the bathroom tap instead. "It's the house," Kamal's father said, his voice trembling. "It's angry." They had no choice but to cut off the water supply from the main switch outside. But as they did, the electricity in the house began to flicker. Lights blinked on and off, the ceiling fan whirred uncontrollably, and the radio, still unplugged, began to play that haunting melody once more. Panic set in as they huddled together in the living room, trying to make sense of the madness. The children, too scared to speak, clung to their parents, their eyes wide with terror. Eddie felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. And then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, a foul stench filled the air. Kamal's mother, who had gone to check on the rice cooker, let out a horrified scream. Eddie ran to her side and saw it. The rice cooker was filled with something that made his stomach churn, a piece of feces, steaming and foul, sitting atop the freshly cooked rice. Eddie gagged and stumbled back, barely making it outside before he vomited. The others followed, their faces twisted in disgust and fear. They gathered outside in the pouring rain, too afraid to re-enter the house. "We need to leave," Kamal's father said, his voice shaky. "This place is cursed." But leaving wasn't an option. The landlord had made it clear that they would forfeit their deposit if they broke the lease, and they couldn't afford to lose that money. They were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. That night, they slept in the car, the doors locked and windows cracked open just enough to let in some air. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled, but they were too exhausted to care. They just wanted the night to be over. The next morning, they awoke to the sound of birds chirping, the storm having finally passed. Eddie felt a sliver of hope as the sun rose, its rays cutting through the darkness of the previous night. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But as they re-entered the house, they were met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick and heavy, the walls seemed to close in on them, and that stench, faint but unmistakable, still lingered. Kamal's father made a decision. "We are leaving today," he announced, his voice firm. "We'll talk to the landlord and sort things out later, but we can't stay here any longer." They packed their belongings in record time, shoving clothes and personal items into bags, eager to be free of the house's malevolent grip. But as they made their final preparations to leave, the true horror of the house made itself known. It started with a faint smell of smoke. At first, they thought it was just their imagination, a leftover sense of fear from the night before. But then the smoke alarm went off, and they realized with growing panic that the house was on fire. The fire started in the kitchen, where the cursed teddy bear had been placed after the cleansing. Flames roared to life, consuming the bear and spreading rapidly, as if the house itself was determined to keep them from leaving. They scrambled to get out, but the flames spread faster than they could move. The heat was intense, the smoke suffocating, and the sound of the fire crackling and roaring filled the air. Eddie could barely see through the thick smoke, but he managed to grab Kamal's hand, pulling him towards the front door. They burst outside just as the fire department arrived, sirens blaring. The firefighters worked quickly, dousing the flames and containing the blaze before it could spread to the neighboring houses. But the damage was done. The house was destroyed, a charred, smoking ruin. As they stood in the driveway, watching the firefighters douse the last of the flames, Eddie couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. The house was gone, along with whatever evil had been haunting them, but the scars would remain, a reminder of the nightmare they had lived through. As the fire chief approached them, his face grim, Eddie knew there would be questions, but there were no answers that made sense, no explanation for the horrors they had witnessed. All they knew was that the house in Seremban 2 was cursed, and they were lucky to have escaped with their lives. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.